Record on. All right, peace, greetings, everyone. My name is Annie Zonneveld, and I'm the founder and president of Muslims for Progressive Values. I'm really happy to have Professor Adis Duderija here with us. He's been an incredible feminist scholar of Islam, and his contribution to the scholarship, which obviously have enabled us as Muslims for Progressive Values to really take the scholarship and run with it in how we advocate for human rights in the context of Islam. Professor Adis Duderija is a first-generation Bosnian Australian. He obtained his PhD in 2010 at the Center for Muslim States and Societies at the University of Western Australia on interpretational methodologies of Quran and Sunnah in neo-traditional Salafism and progressive Islam. He is currently an academic at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia, where he teaches courses on Islam and gender, Islamic intellectual tradition, and Islam and Muslims in the West. He is the author of 9 books and over 100 academic publications. And one of his publications is on MPV's website, which he has generously contributed as a way for us to promote that progressive Islam theology and as a way for us to raise funds for the work that we do. So with that, Adis, I invite you to please screen share.
Thank you, Annie. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for being here. And my sincere thanks to Muslims for Progressive Values and Annie in particular for having me here tonight. As far as your time zone is concerned, it's it's morning here in Australia. Now, before I start with my presentation, I would like to congratulate Muslims for Progressive Values for the 17th anniversary, if I'm not mistaken. They've been doing some wonderful work over these years, and incidentally, actually, it occurred to me earlier this morning, I think, when Annie mentioned, when I read 17 years, I went back into my publications, and it was actually 17 years ago as well that I had my first academic publication on progressive Islam. So I'm celebrating 17 years as well. Celebrating together.
We celebrate together, yes.
Yeah. So, as Annie just mentioned, a couple of months ago, we published a collection of essays, if you like, on progressive Islam that is meant to be oriented towards a non-academic audience that is interested in intellectual discussions pertaining to contemporary Islam in particular, and what does it actually mean to subscribe to a progressive Muslim way of thinking, theology, identity. In my presentation, essentially, I'm going to just quickly provide an overview of what that ebook that can be purchased on the Muslims for Progressive Values website, what kind of ideas or themes are being discussed, so that you can have a more informed kind of opinion about whether or not you want to have a deeper, more careful look into the booklet. So there are 13 essays. I really try to gather the most important ideas, a kind of a comprehensive yet a comprehensive overview that doesn't go into hundreds and hundreds of pages. So I think the booklet is only about 80 pages or so. It consists of 13 essays. In the first essay, basically, I kind of self-position myself, why I believe what I believe in, and as you can see, there's an emphasis on rationalism in terms of how to approach the religious texts, feminism, critical thought of Sufism, and something called process relational theology. It kind of provides, I want to provide the reader like a an explanation of my worldview, which kind of cannot be divorced entirely from how I have tried to think about progressive Muslim thought. The next essay basically looks into the ideas of one of my gurus, Professor Ibrahim Musa, and his concept of critical Islam, or pardon me, critical traditionalism, and basically critical traditionalism is essentially what I'm arguing is same as progressive Islam, with a lot of emphasis. Critical traditionalism is rooted in this idea of human dignity. Everyone has, every human being, regardless of any of the secondary identities, has a, we all share that basic human dignity that is, from those of us who believe in a theistic worldview, is divinely granted to all of us, and it's a kind of a starting point for our ethics and our theology. And then the next essay provides an outline of the major, what I call, delineating features. This is basically a summary of my second monograph on progressive Islam, called Imperatives of Progressive Islam, such as the importance of gender egalitarian interpretations of Islam, a human rights-based approach, contextualist and rationalist theology, Islamic liberation theology. So it talks about all of these major themes, if you like, in progressive Muslim thought. The subsequent essay, as the title suggests, explores this idea how progressive Islam's approach to the Islamic intellectual tradition is uniquely positioned to overcome this problem we have been facing as a Muslim community, especially with the last 30 to 40 years of Islamic sectarianism. Next essay is a little bit provocative, and it essentially, I try to counter this idea that any ethically and politically robust form of Islam or approach to the Islamic tradition inevitably has to be based on conservative or extremist jihadist forms of political Islam, that it is possible also to be a progressive Islamist, but of course within the confines of the broader progressive Islamic thinking that accepts human rights, modern human rights norms and values, as well as constitutional democracy. So the subsequent essay, as you can see again from the title, it's all about
we can't see your screen. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I thought I wasn't sharing after all. My apologies. Yeah, so I'm up to 7. Yeah, now it is. Oh yeah. So I hope I don't need to go back, but
no, it's fine. It's fine.
The essay titles speak for themselves quite a bit. So I'm at point 7, essay 7, where I explore this idea of like in essay 5, where I look at how progressive Islam is uniquely positioned to overcome Islamic sectarianism. I apply the same kind of logic, but in relation to how progressive Islam and the kind of ideas and values it stands for can also counteract Islamophobia, because whether we like it or not, certain forms of Islam actually contribute to anti-Muslim sentiments and Islamophobia. So this is kind of a response to that. Essay number 8 examines progressive Muslim thought as a contemporary form of Sufi-like ethical moral philosophy. So basically this idea that progressive Islam has many affinities with certain forms of Sufism in the classical Islamic tradition, but it takes away the classical theistic theology, the misogyny or the androgyny, and androcentric, I should say, strong androcentric impulses, and this very hierarchical kind of relationship between the master and the disciple. So it explores this idea. Number 9 is all about how, again, progressive Islamic thinking can help the Muslim majority world achieve the SDGs, by being strong on gender equality, on religious pluralism that fosters social cohesion, by advocating for constitutional democracy type of political governance. All of these kinds of ideas, I think, are very conducive to Muslim majority countries achieving the SDGs. The 10th essay is all about this idea. It counters this idea that, you know, Islam is all about Islamic jurisprudence and theology, yeah? and views Islam through and looks at Islam through a civilizational as a civilizational entity with a rich cosmopolitan heritage, yeah, and how it's important to maintain and kind of emphasize that dynamic cosmopolitan Islamic civilizational heritage that we've had in the past, and that how progressive Muslim thought is the best embodiment of those kinds of approaches. Some of our listeners might remember, might be familiar with Shadab Ahmed's book on what is Islam, the importance of being Islamic, where he goes into the cosmopolitan, often forgotten cosmopolitan Islamic civilizational rich tradition. So it's kind of linked to these kinds of ideas. Number 11 is actually really my PhD thesis that Ani mentioned earlier on, or parts of it, that often this question of, and this is a question that I asked myself, starting in my late teens, how come we have very, very different interpretations of the same bodies of text? Yeah, and where do these differences in interpretation come from? So in my PhD thesis, one of the things I did is I identified or delineated 7 or 8 of these different interpretational methodology related issues and assumptions that give rise to traditional or even puritanical forms of Islam and progressives. So I go into, in that essay, I kind of provide a broad overview of what these interpretational models are and what are their main delineating features. Second last essay is all about how to understand the Quran as a form of revelation, or the theory of revelation or concept of revelation in progressive Islam. Yeah, and it is quite distinct from the orthodox approach that is very much based on this idea of Quran as being a verbatim word of God, and it's based on a very kind of textualist approach to revelation, whereas the concept of revelation in progressive Islam is not restricted to the Quran itself. And finally, we all know that this concept of Sunnah and the Hadith has played a very important role in the way Islamic jurisprudence, ethics, and theology has developed, and Quranic exegesis, and many of the ethical and moral problems that contemporary Muslim societies are grappling with can be traced to certain views on what is Sunnah. I have, in some of my earlier work, also have, with some colleagues of mine, academic colleagues of mine, we have looked at this concept of Sunnah, how it had evolved over time, and how it is a much more broad, dynamic concept, and it's not restricted just to this idea of a Sahih Hadith or authentic Hadith, and how this approach to Sunnah can actually enable us to overcome, especially the patriarchal interpretations of the Islamic tradition. So it kind of goes in some detail into these kinds of discussions, and that's the final essay. So hopefully this is a coherent kind of exposition of what progressive Muslim theology and an approach to Islamic intellectual tradition from a progressive Muslim perspective is all about. And I look forward to your questions.
Can you take down the table of contents, and then we can just spotlight you? And then if you all don't mind, I'd like to ask the first question. Well, first of all, are you guys okay with being on camera? If you don't, that's fine too. You can, and then my next instruction is just unmute your microphone when you have a question, and you can raise your hand so I can call on you for the Q&A. But I'm going to go with the first question. So the last one, I mean, it was really wonderful for me to see this page, Progressive Islam, splattered all over the paper, because I remember 17 years ago when we started in Muslims for Progressive Values, the word Progressive Islam was really blasphemous, and we got so much pushback and ridicule for the term Progressive Islam. And then so I'm obviously very happy that this is actually mainstreamed into a science into itself. So that's number one. And the point that you made about the last one, about the Sunnah, the Progressive Islam, in regards to how we look at the Sunnah, can you give us an example or something that is really misogynistic that you've been able to turn it around from the hermeneutics of Progressive Islam?
Sure, thanks, Annie. I'll take that the first thing you talked about is just a comment rather than a question. I'd like to again applaud you for showing resiliency and commitment to continue to be convinced in the value of progressive Muslim thought and promoting it in various circles and among various networks. I think it's essential that not just Muslims but non-Muslims are aware of the fact that that they have progressive partners within the Muslim community. We hear a lot about progressive Christianity, progressive reformist, reform Judaism, or people on the political left spectrum who are often, looking very like they are very, open to having a Muslim partner who subscribes to similar worldview. And, in the past, it has been lacking. They haven't been able to find such a community. But with your work and similar-minded people, I think we have also demonstrated to non-Muslims that progressive Islam is a serious contender, a viable option and approach to Islamic tradition. And I think in many ways we have contributed to the revival of some of the progressive currents that in other religious or non-religious forms of thinking and worldviews. So wonderful. Regarding the question of Sunnah, well, one concrete example that kind of always comes to my mind is many Muslim family laws, for example. Like if we look at classical Muslim family law, the entire edifice is based upon this concept of qiwama and wilaya, male guardianship, male guardianship of women, which brings, there's a host of issues associated with that. Child marriages, polygamy, female genital mutilation or cutting, that's just honor-based violence also. All of these really, in one way or another, could lead us to a particular, they are relevant in the context of how the concept of Sunnah has been, from my perspective, really misunderstood, because it's been conflated with a hadith-based approach. And not only that, classical Islamic thought has elevated the concept of Sunnah, or the idea of Sunnah has been given, it's been elevated to a status of revelation itself. In classical Islam, there are two forms of revelation: wahi matlu, or recited revelation, which is traditionally the Quran, and wahi ghayr al-matlu, which is non-recited form of revelation. And the tradition conflates this with the idea of Sunnah, and conflates the concept of Sunnah with the idea of an authentic hadith. So we unfortunately have quite a lot of misogynistic and androcentric hadiths that have been used to construct Muslim family laws that have reduced women to kind of a secondary status, that have reduced their autonomy, especially in relation to family dynamics, and this entire system of male guardianship really primarily rests on hadith-based evidence. Yes, there is certain Quranic verses also, like 434 and 228, but you know, that have been used to justify these kinds of ideas and approach to Islamic jurisprudence and ethics. But it's primarily this concept of sunnah in traditional thought that has given this, that has you know, caused a lot of problem and prevented the Islamic tradition from becoming more gender egalitarian.
Sabahat?
Yes, can you hear me clearly? I just wanted to be sure my mic was working.
Yes.
Okay. So I had a couple of issues to raise. I really love the example you just gave between Hadith and Sunnah, which is, and it's good to see that distinction now start to be made even by very traditionalist people, especially in the very old school traditional, which I'll come back to in a minute. But two things I wanted to get your comment on. One is, how much do you see your role and the role of academia as being descriptive versus being prescriptive? At one level, you do see what's going on, and then you come back and report and sort of provide the ideological basis for it, which is, I find in our own work, amazingly useful. But what are your thoughts on that prescriptive versus descriptive dichotomy? And also some thoughts, your thoughts on my pet issue, which is that this is often not a two-cornered fight, but a three-cornered fight. That is, in fact, maybe even four. There's the progressives, but on the other side, you have the old school traditionalists like my parents or a lot of our parents, and then the neo-purist Salafi interpretation, which is now about two generations into dominating, especially the Western Muslim landscape. And therefore, often when I'm afraid that sometimes when we react to what we think of as medieval things, we're actually reacting to a very modern neo-purist interpretation, not the traditional one. I mean, the traditional one has its own problems. The patriarchy and all is already there in the old traditional conservative forms. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on those two things.
Thanks, Sabahat. So the first question pertains to this idea of, I'm not sure if you're referring to me in my personally in my roles. How do I negotiate my roles as an academic, someone from a Muslim background who also is values activism and takes part in mainly digital, but also in interfaith dialogue. One thing that I have tried to do is, and this has come out of my PhD thesis, is to raise awareness of this interpretability, if you like, of the Islamic tradition and how it is constructed. That there's no such thing. When we look in popular discourses, like in imams in mosques or even traditional Muslim scholars, are not very transparent when it comes to explaining. In terms of their self-positioning, why are they thinking the way they are thinking? Where are their thoughts and interpretational kind of approach comes from? And like, there is not that much transparency, and it's often rather dogmatic in that sense. So what I've tried to do is, I've always tried to be a proponent of this idea that we all need to kind of be able to be critical thinkers and understand why are people coming from certain perspectives, to be able to deconstruct these perspectives, and then be able to critically assess and evaluate and judge their points of view. Yeah, so I find there's a great deal of value in this kind of approach, because it allows us to not get imprisoned and not to make this kind of fallacy fall into the to be able to liberate, let's say, ourselves as well as Islam from this idea of a kind of a straight-jacketed mono how shall I call it? Nobody, in other words, nobody has monopoly on the Islamic tradition. It is very much a constructed thing, and that it's a product of hundreds of years of thinking. Certain people have tried to monopolize it, but there's always been contention between various groups, which brings me to your second question. So for first question, I think it's appropriate at times to be purely descriptive, especially like in scholarship, and if you are intellectual historian, it's more about, you know, a conceptual and descriptive approach. But I think there is more value and more need to engage in critical deconstructive kind of thinking. Regarding your second question, yeah, my colleague and I here at Griffith University 2 or 3 years ago did this study on Islam and Muslim communities in Australia, and it was very comprehensive. And one of the questions was on we were trying to group people into different what we call Islamic orientations or typologies. So we provided them with different sets of descriptors, like rather than labeling them a priori from the start. We asked them which one of these descriptors applies to your approach and your way of understanding Islam the most. Yeah, and then we use literature on typologies or these Islamic orientations behind the scenes, and then kind of cross-reference them and kind of align them. And actually, to my great surprise, this study had more than 1,000 participants, and it was very representative. We consulted with major Muslim organizations throughout Australia. We did a small pilot study as well. So it was very rigorous methodologically as well. And to our surprise, actually, the 2 highest scoring typologies were liberal and progressive. Yeah, so while I do not deny the fact that there are these puritanical and staunchly what we call neo-traditional approaches to Islam, especially institutions are still dominated, mosques and organizations are dominated by these let's call them neoclassical, or what I call a madhabist approach, you know, the Hanafi, Shafi, as opposed to Salafi or Athari. I think there is a bit of a and I fall into this trap myself. There is a bit of I guess the majority, the silent majority kind of syndrome, you know. Most of us tend to be more moderate, more progressive, more liberal. It's just that we are not seen as much or heard as much. Whereas the puritanicals and the neo-traditionalists tend to dominate even online, and as I said, they have a lot of institutional backing. So there's a bit of a kind of a distortion in our minds, and also among non-Muslims, unfortunately. Often Islam is associated primarily with neo-traditional and puritanical approaches.
Well, I think that assessment of what you surprisingly discovered of the majority being in Australia being progressive or liberal minded, it's the same here. It's the same scenario. The conservative the institutions are the conservative and with, you know, financial backing. But according to Pew Research, as of 2017, I think a good 69-70% of American Muslims actually find spiritual inspiration outside the mosque. So, you know, so yeah, and there were other markers, other questions that they asked that really indicated they were definitely in the progressive and liberal camp, right? So, we have a question from Mariam. Please go ahead. Sabah, lower your hand, please. Please go ahead, Mariam.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I came late, so I apologize if this was already covered. I saw in your points, in your outline, there was a part about revelation, and you were saying that many people see that the Quran is the only way of there being revelation. And even though, I was raised very strict Muslim and went to Islamic elementary school, I've actually never heard anyone say that before. So I'm very curious if you could speak more to what you're referring to when you talk about other kinds of revelation. Yeah, I would just love to hear more about that.
Sure. Thanks, Mariam. Traditionally speaking, the Muslim theologians engaged in these debates about the nature of the Quran as revelation. And it's related to a set of questions pertaining to the nature of God's attributes. And so there were these disagreements whether or not God's speech as one of the sifatullah, or the elements, attributes of God, is co-constituent with God, or is it a derivative, let's call a derivative secondary attribute of God. And the orthodoxy that took hundreds of years to develop ended up basically saying that Kalamullah, or speech of God, is an essential attribute of God and is kind of co-constitutive with God, and therefore Quran as a form, as Kalamullah, is also eternal, co-eternal with God, and therefore Quran has been given this meta-historical dimension, purely ontologically verbatim word of God that has an ontological quality of being Kalamullah and co-eternal with God, and that had certain interpretational hermeneutical implications. Also, they de-emphasize this idea that Quran has little or nothing to do with the nature of religious experience of Muhammad, of Prophet Muhammad. So that Muhammad was just this kind of a parrot or a loudspeaker through which God spoke. And if you elevate the Quran to such kind of ontological level, obviously that has huge implications in terms of to what extent we are able to contextualize the Quranic injunctions, especially those that have socio-legal implications. So it kind of I don't know if this is a correct word, divinizes the Quran. It gives the divine a meta-historical kind of metaphysical quality that is beyond just a pure, it's not kind of metaphysically on, a very high kind of standing, if you like. But we do have progressive Muslim scholars who have developed theories of revelation that are much more, let's say, historical or contextualist. Professor Fazlur Rahman, the famous modernist of the 20th century, has said that the Quran is both, well, to what extent this is a coherent statement, we can discuss, debate this, but I'm trying to say that there is more nuanced approach, that the Quran is both a product of Prophet Muhammad's religious experience as it is a divine source. And Fazlur Rahman used the ideas of Ibn Sina to kind of justify this idea. Then there is the modernist Allama Muhammad Iqbal, who also emphasized the importance of religious experience of the Prophet, how that affected the nature of the Quran. Professor Nasir Abu Zaid talks about the Quran having a literary quality. It should be approached as literature. Then some scholars go even further than that. Shabestari, Iranian scholar, talks about the Quran as entirely a byproduct of Prophet Muhammad's religious experience. That there is no such thing as purely divine text. My thinking has also evolved on this issue. I believe now that the Quran should be approached through a process relational metaphysics and philosophy, and that the kind of within the metaphysical constraints of a process relational theology, which basically has a much broader understanding of the concept of revelation. It's not restricted to some person who lived 1,000 years ago. It's kind of this within Sufism, more radical forms of Sufism, if you like Ibn al-Arabi's, the idea that we are all mystics, we all have religious experience, that we can all have a kind of a form of revelation and an inspiration. Like in Sufism, there is the concept of ilham, inspiration, as a form of revelation that is also accessible to us, and that every religious experience, Professor Abdul Karim Soroush talks about, every religious experience, including the prophetic religious experience, is contingent, historical, contextualist, and it can evolve. Yeah, and we have these kinds of ideas in more radical forms of Sufism that I just talked about. So, and of course, revelation in progressive Islam also, the Quran talks about looking into ourselves and the signs within each human being. There are ayatullah, the signs of God in nature. So it's a much more democratic and approach to revelation, to the concept of revelation and its sources.
Interesting. I didn't know these various ways of thinking about that. We have the next question coming from Darius Fatimi.
Yeah, hi Adis, it's good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise, Darius, yeah.
Since I met you at UC Berkeley, I think over a year ago, I've read some more of your works. I recently read the article you wrote in Tikkun magazine, where you outline, I think it's like 7 points of a progressive Muslim identity. And the first point talks about embracing a Sufi pan-entheistic worldview or ideology. And I'm just curious if you can give me 2 definitions to simplify my question, 2 definitions. How do you differentiate pantheism from panentheism? You use the word panentheism. How do those fit in with some of the Sufi traditions, that we're so proud of? And then the other term you use a lot in your writings is process theology. You just mentioned it in reference to Miriam's question. I'm still trying to clarify for myself what that means. I'm teaching a psychology of religion class this semester, and I want to be able to, hopefully, if you can give me a layperson definition of these terms so I can communicate them to my students. I'm really interested in Jungian psychology, and it seems to me that a process theology is very much in the same lane as maybe Carl Jung's understanding of the divine. But I'm, just curious if you can help me.
Sure, yeah.
Feel these concepts a little bit: pantheism, panentheism, process theology, for a layperson, if you will.
Yeah, sure. Well, let's look at the panentheism. So, even if we just restrict it to an etymological kind of level of analysis, pantheism means everything is God. Yeah, pantheism, everything, everything, theism, God. Panentheism means everything in God. All right, so there's a crucial distinction there, everything in God. So it's like, let's say that God is like a womb and everything is kind of within the womb, but it's kind of, panentheism is the broader cosmology of metaphysics is based upon this idea of the cosmos as organism, not as some kind of a machine, like it's an organism that is ever evolving. Yeah. So we are kind of,
in some way it gives birth. Maybe metaphorically, birth.
Okay. Exactly. We are co-evolving alongside with God. It's like a dynamic. It's a deeply interrelational metaphysics.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And in some ways, it feels like it makes some distinction between the creator and the creation.
Yeah.
Whereas pantheism, it's a little bit more fused.
It equates completely with God, whereas the total of God is always an kind of the outcome of all of these relationships plus one. Yeah. Yeah. Because it's always kind of dynamic and deeply interrelational. I hope that kind of makes sense.
No, that
Process theology, yeah. Process theology is a sub-branch of process relational philosophy So process relational thinking goes primarily, I mean, the modern forms to Alfred North Whitehead, but Alfred North Whitehead hasn't really written that much on religion. But his student, Charles Hartshorne, is really the one who has probably, we can say, the proper process theologian, Professor Charles Hartshorne. And basically he says that, you know, like even in our tradition, we have the distinction between the immanent and the transcendental nature of God, yeah, the Jamal and the Jalal aspects of God. So so two things with process theology to keep it like manageable. Process theology emphasizes the idea of religious experience of the individual comes first. Yeah. So that's how we can know God the best, rather than relying on some sacred scripture from 1,000 years ago or 5,000 or whatever it is. So that's kind of synergizes with the Quranic injunction of "we are closer to you than your jugular vein," kind of thinking. Yeah. So the emphasis on the personal religious experience. Yeah, and Charles Hartshorne makes a distinction between God's existence and God's actuality. So God's existence is that transcendental, non-changing, if you like, essence of God. But because because the cosmos is like an organism deeply interrelational, God also has an immanent nature or consequential nature, using the terminology of process relational theology. And kind of there's a lot of emphasis on this immanent quality of God. Yeah, and there is a rejection of classical theistic approach to God. You know, God is not God is not someone like God is not entirely timeless. Yeah.
That he's not
so
the
God has
unmoved mover, so to speak.
Exactly, that's the one. Yeah, I was not an unmoved mover. Does not know. God knows all the potentialities for the future, but God cannot know what is not yet to be known. But once it is known, God can know what is known. But because the cosmos is probabilistic in nature, as quantum mechanics tells us and all of that kind of thing, it's only probabilistic. Future is only probabilistic in nature. So God also does not have. And there were some, like in Islamic tradition, there were certain schools of thought that also emphasized this idea that God is not omniscient in a classical theistic sense of the word. Yeah. And also the final kind of delineation is process theology. The idea of love is very important in the sense that God's character. Or you know, when we look at all of the God's attributes, usually when we develop a theology of God or concept of God, we have to kind of like either prioritize God's omniscience versus, let's say, God's benevolence. Because if God is omniscient, like if or all powerful, if we say that God is all powerful, but we see that there is a lot of evil, and at the same time, or most compassionate and most yeah, then these two really, I mean, we see there's a lot of evil being committed in the world, and you know, God is like just a bystander. If God was indeed all powerful, then God would be evil or unethical, because so it's all so. But if God in process relational theology, and this is where again there's many affinities with Sufism. You know, the relationship between the beloved, the two beloveds, the idea of a beloved. There's affinities here. God has placed, let's say, has limited herself, or it has prioritized conceptually this concept of the love, uncoercive. God cannot coerce us, just kind of lure us, try to persuade us towards the initial name of God, which is beauty, justice, and mercy. Yeah, but God is not. God doesn't have a body. So if a child runs out runs out into the onto the street and the car hits the child, God could not have prevented that, in that sense. But God could have inspired me as a bystander, inspired love and compassion in me to kind of come to the child's rescue, or that's and like God works through God's creation. It's all, remember, interrelated kind of metaphysics.
Like, I think of the distinction that maybe God does not act upon us, but he interacts with us.
Exactly. Yeah, it's always we are co-creators with God. That's another major premise or postulate of process relational theology. Every creature has a certain degree of autonomy within the confines of what is possible for them biologically. And so we can think of God as that kind of initial kind of, in Islamic tradition, God as source of justice, beauty, and mercy, for example. So these higher ideals that God cannot impose upon us, but can kind of these are kind of our guiding values that the God is the perfect embodiment of, and God is luring us towards. And so it's that kind of metaphysic. It's not a classical theistic kind of approach to concept of God.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. I could riff off this for many more hours, but I want to make room for other questions.
I hope it's enough just for you to, and of course I encourage you. Thomas J. Ord has written a lot, Thomas J. Ord has some non-complicated, let's say, kind of readily accessible books on this, The Uncontrolling God. Then recently he published a book he coined a new term. Instead of all-powerful, all-loving, and he used it like the Latin word amipotent, all-loving, to kind of convey this idea.
Adis, we are close to, we've got 10 minutes before we hit the hour, but Kevin, if you bear with me, there is one question that somebody submitted, so that if I can read that, and if you can do a brief response, Adis, and then we can go to Kevin as the last question, probably. Is Ibn Sina considered as progressive thinker? Could you elaborate a bit of the differences between Ibn Sina versus Al-Ghazali? I see a lot of Muslim scholars on YouTube referencing Al-Ghazali, and for me, his idea seems more conservative.
Number one, I'm really not an expert on either Ibn Sina or Al-Ghazali. So Ibn Sina, when I think of Ibn Sina, I think of this philosopher king idea, a very elitist approach to knowledge. And Ibn Sina, in a way, values philosophy more than what we would call classical Islamic legal theory. But he had a very elitist approach to knowledge. Both of them had very misogynistic views, for example. So Ibn Sina also, unfortunately, couldn't escape patriarchy. But I guess the progressive element of Ibn Sina is this idea that philosophy is more important than theology, or that theology is a byproduct of a philosophical worldview or thinking. So that it's the philosophy that governs and manipulates theology, so to speak. Whereas Al-Ghazali was much more circumspect and much more, I guess, anti-philosophy, although he himself engaged in philosophy and was an Asharite, so which in itself. But Al-Ghazali, for example, was very much a classical theist, and he said, he didn't, he very much followed classical theistic. If God wills, God can break nature laws and all these kinds of miracles kind of stuff. Of course, Al-Ghazali also, in terms of his legal theory, he used hadith. He was like, he didn't have issues with using even so-called weak hadith. That's why Salafis are against him. And it depends pretty much on what kind of work are we talking about. Ghazali has written Islamic legal theory related subjects where his thinking is kind of different compared to when he gives advice to kings, where his thinking is, you know, much more simplistic and very much misogynistic. So it's really, really difficult. But I guess that the one meaningful distinction would be this idea of the Ibn Sina has a much more contextualist also approach to the revelation and believes that philosophy and the scope and nature of revelation is like, basically he says revelation is for ordinary people, ordinary believers who don't really have well-functioning intellects, whereas really philosophers don't really need revelation in that sense. You know, that's how I would draw a distinction between them. But again, this is I really don't have sufficient knowledge. It's not my forte.
Yeah. Kevin Moog, your question.
Okay.
Can I already answer? I don't know.
Well, that's my answer is I don't know, but so I'm not sure if this is going to be well formulated. But as maybe one might be a definitional. Okay, let me contextualize this. As I see in a lot of debate spaces, there seem to be, even in terms of contemporary politics, there seems to be coming together from the populist right and from the left, sort of a profound critique of modernism. I guess that would be one of the, critiques. So and the term progressive is kind of part of that debate and is perhaps at issue to some extent. So I'm sure that you may have defined it better in some of your work, but it also has that idea of progress, everything's getting better, and sort of becomes conflated with, or liberalism with, becomes associated with, neoliberalism and individualism and secularism, has been bantered around, it gets thrown around a lot by people on the right and left, and they actually share some of these perspectives. And now it's funny, I see even people I used to think of as more conservative, Muslims, it's like they took a graduate course in critical theory and are using some of these ideas. I don't know if they're misusing it, perhaps, but I don't have the education to really, so we see some of the people like Talal Assad, or I think it's like Wael Halat, and I haven't read these people in depth, but I see them being appropriated by fairly conservative people, as a critique of modernism and the modern nation state. And, some of this gets in, I think you do mention somewhere, like, what is a progressive Islamism? I mean, is there an alternative to, neoliberal, modernistic, secular capitalism, basically, I'm trying to figure this out and maybe try to figure out a reading list to try to deal with this stuff a little bit better, because I haven't done some of the work. But if you have any words of wisdom, just how to deal with this bigger issue.
I might have some words, but I don't know if they are wise.
Okay.
Look, all I can say is, like, the idea of progressive, the way I look at it, it's about this, again, it's especially the first two books on that I wrote, the monographs on what is progressive Islam in that sense. It's more of a kind of a reaction to and a correction of the predominant paradigm. Yeah. So to understand progressive Islam, we need to understand the mainstream Sunnism, and it's like a critique of mainstream Sunnism. Yeah. So from an epistemological perspective, for example, approach to knowledge, one of the delineating features of progressive Islam is epistemological openness and methodological pluralism, or sometimes I joke and I say promiscuity. Now, to understand that, we need to understand the mainstream classical paradigm that invests heavily in this idea of perfection found in the past, follow the Salaf, follow the Khalaf, the concept of Salafism itself is based upon this idea that history, as we go further away from the time of the Quran and the early Muslim community, we by definition are regressing, and we are in a less of a good position, so to speak, to know God's will, to be closer to the Prophet, and to be, we are kind of, there's this idea of, as the time goes by, we are inevitably deviating further and further away from the ideal that was located in the past. Yeah. Whereas progressive Islam kind of makes a correction to that, and says that and there's and conservatism by definition is very suspicious of change. Yeah, there's no such thing as good change, essentially. So that's why this concept of bid'ah, which actually in the beginning didn't have that connotation anyway, but later on it did. Like there's a hadith that every innovation, it leads to hellfire and something like that. So in that sense, so the progressive Islam comes in and says, no, and because the classical Islamic tradition has an Aristotelian approach to ethics, that is kind of very hierarchical, in a sense that there are all these ideas about ethics being different, based upon the hierarchy where you are in the overall society, and that also takes gender into consideration. You have this elitist group of men philosophers who have the intellect intact, and they are kind of operating at the highest level. Then you have the rest of the men, and then you have women and children and slaves, and it's that kind of it's that kind of approach to ethics that doesn't it's not contextualist enough. It conflates a certain understanding of the concept of justice or a context of equality that might have made sense 1,000 years ago given those kind of conditions, but it freezes them in time, so that the concept of justice is no longer interrelational or contextual. It loses that quality, so it's being kind of constantly imposed upon the present. The idea of the past constantly imposing itself upon the present and limiting the future. So there is no scope for any kind of meaningful consequential change. While progressive Islam wants to break away from that, from that kind of approach. In that sense, it is progressive. And if we take that progressive theology seriously, every new generation needs to react to God's lure and invitation towards beauty, justice, and compassion in their own context. This, the way the society and culture worked 1,000 years ago is very different to what it is today, even though conservatives want to tell us that, no, not really, we are not better off, or that. That's patently not true. This has been progress in many, in quality of living and everything. What's his name? The Harvard professor Pinker has written on this a lot. So yeah. So again, it's very difficult if we operate within the confines of classical Islamic theology, legal theory, the divine command theory, that you can only know what's good or right based on text and revelation. It's very difficult. It's impossible actually to create any new change. Not like especially like change pertaining to like values and ethics and what it means to be a human being. Yeah. Whereas progressive Islam kind of wants to counter that and to say that it is always possible to better approximate but never exhaust this vision of God, which is what Sharia usually actually is, as Professor Khalid Abul Fazl has talked about. It's apart from it being a process and a methodology, it's also a moral inquiry. It's an attempt to approximate the divine, and the divine is viewed as this in terms of aesthetics, the beauty, mercy, justice, all these components, which can never be kind of fully realized because they are very interrelational, deeply interrelational, contextual, and that every person, not just every generation, but every person kind of given their own background, given their own contingencies, like I know it is deeply kind of contextual, so therefore laws that govern societies need to be constructed in a way that they retain this contextualist interrelational element to them, and they're able to respond to changes in context. So it's all about having the ability to change in response to changes in context, broader context. And modernity, postmodernity, like in my books, I have used the work of Professor Sheila Ben Habib, who is actually a Turkish Jewish scholar, and she talks about a moderate or a weak form. I don't know if I think she uses a weak form of postmodernism. And I think progressive Islam's worldview in relation to the debates between modernity and postmodernity, I think fits the best that concept of weak postmodernity. So not this radical form of postmodernity where you just deconstruct for the sake of deconstruction, Derrida, but there is an important element of reconstruction or constructing. It's not just deconstructing the traditionalist ideas, but also providing an alternative. And it's related to the issues of cultural relativism versus universalism. And again, here progressive Islam would be that qualified universalism, again, in the importance of context, that one particular solution in one context could be the most just, but in a different context, the opposite of it would be more just. Sometimes I know how much time we have. We probably have run out of time. I don't know if I should bring this example
Go
up.
ahead,
But in classical Muslim law, the wife is not, she can keep her income, she doesn't need to really religiously, from a religion perspective, she doesn't need to contribute to the household. So what about, and then I was talking, after one of my lectures, was talking to a young man who comes from a conservative background. I asked him, would you still insist on that if you, if you are unemployed, you've been unemployed for months and months and months, your wife is, working out there, has a good income, does it still make sense? Is it still just for her to keep all the money, and you still have to, the whole family, you have to provide for the whole family based on the government, kind of the basic government income that you get, So while this idea of women keeping the income and not being responsible for expenditure, household expenditure, might have made sense 1,000 years ago in the 11th century, where women were, the idea of an ideal woman is someone who stays at home, doesn't have a public life, because of certain other assumptions, the idea of fitna and all of that kind of stuff. Women didn't really have any kind of educational experience, world experience. So kind of it was kind of reasonable, I guess, to not require them to contribute to the family income, because they didn't really live an active public life and couldn't really generate income unless they had inherited wealth or whatever. But to insist on these kinds of to kind of just apply these same rules in a completely different context, it becomes unjust, becomes unreasonable,
So what did he say?
He said he's going to marry two wives that have that have high income.
I know you are joking. But no, the thing about it, I think there was in the social context, the application of this very archaic rule. In Malaysia, there was a man who married 4 wives, and his wives worked, and then his wives basically supported him. And the one wife would be the babysitter, and he basically was a loser of a husband. So it's just incredible how they've used that this traditional interpretation. But I really learned a lot today. especially I love this interrelational thing between us as human beings and God. And that makes a lot of sense in why there's a lot of evil. And so basically it's our God-given brain to think and to act in an ethical way or not, right? And so I think that takes away this notion that that I've been taught since a young child, is that God knows everything and your destiny is written, and all of that. So as if that's an
the dualistic approach to like is really that does a lot of damage, so metaphysical dualism is hugely problematic, and classical theism buys into that, so
So I really appreciate this. Thank you, Adis, and thank you everyone for joining us. Hopefully we'll be doing more of this with different scholars of Islam, and there's always a lot to learn, and there's a lot that we need to learn for ourselves in order to really make this world a better place. Thank you, and I bid everyone farewell, and happy anniversary to you too for your 17th year, and tomorrow's MPV's 17th birthday. So
it's wonderful to see some familiar faces. Hope we can meet again.
Yeah. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.